All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We will now get started. I hope you can see us. We can't see you, but we hope for an interactive and engaging session. You can at least type questions into the chat, so I will try to incorporate them as we go. My name is Aubrey Hruby, and I am a senior fellow at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. But I have long worked to facilitate investment into African markets. I've had the honor and privilege of working across 30 African countries over the past 18 years. And I am so pleased today to be joined by a good and old friend, Fred Swaniker, who is the founder and CEO of many things, but the African Leadership Group. And that includes the African Leadership Academy, university, and many other endeavors, but he has worked steadfastly to work for equal access to opportunity globally. And I think that's a passion that we share. Independent of where you're born, you should be able to access opportunity, and opportunity often comes through education. And there are brilliant minds all across the world. They're not concentrated in any one place, and they should be amplified and allowed to shine and to change the world. So Fred's been working in that area. And the challenge we have and what we're going to be talking today is about job creation. There are 1 million Africans that turn 18 every month. And the job creation challenge on the continent is one that we haven't seen in human history. It's really unprecedented. We need to create more jobs regularly than in India did or that China did, even though their populations are similar. Because of Africa's youth and because of the population growth rates, we have a job creation challenge that is really unprecedented. So Fred, please tell us a little bit about the platform you've created, and then we want to chat about where the jobs are going to come from.
Thanks, Audrey. Nice to see you. So, the work that my colleagues and I are doing is really trying to unlock opportunity for the next generation of African youth, which we see as one of the greatest opportunities that we have, not just for Africa, but for the world, because Africa has the store of the world's young people right now. The rest of the world is aging. The average German or Japanese is 47, whereas in Africa, average age is 19. So the rest of the world, for global growth to continue and for innovation and prosperity to happen, we need to unlock the potential of African youth, because young people tend to be more innovative. They haven't yet been jaded by life. They're much more open to new ideas, and a lot of innovation and prosperity can actually come out of African youth if we can unlock it. So that's the work that my group has been doing. And we are trying to specifically develop leadership capacity in Africa. We're trying to say, let's identify young people that can be the future leaders of Africa. Specifically, we've set a goal of developing 3 million leaders for Africa by 2035. And in doing so, we will be building the leadership capacity for what will one day be 40% of the world's population. Because by the end of the century, 40% of the whole world will be African. And so the goal we set is, can we create the leadership capacity for that critical part of the world? So we select exceptional young people, we develop them, and then we connect them to opportunity. And it's really that simple.
And so tell us a little bit about the platform, and where are you operational? How is it going? Where are you against this 3 million mark?
Well, we have we've been building this machinery over the last 15 years. So we started the African Leadership Academy in South Africa. And then we launched the African Leadership University in Mauritius. We launched the African Leadership University in Rwanda. We launched a business school, which is Pan-African. And then we launched something called ALX, which is now expanded to Nigeria, where we started doing things in South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, and we're also in early stages in Senegal and Ivory Coast. So we're accelerating momentum, and last year we trained about 1,000 people, and next year we expect to train 50,000. So we're scaling much faster now because we're going to be we're leveraging a lot more technology to move faster.
And that 50,000, that's through the ALX program.
Yeah, exactly.
And that training is more shorter term, or how is it different than what happens at ALU?
It's primarily much more about we're stripping out a lot of the things that you might find in a traditional university and focusing on the core that people need to become productive. So we think of ALX as a lifelong learning program where we're giving people just-in-time skills to make them effective. So we have programs that are working with recent university graduates who have gotten the academic training, but they're not employable. And we take them through 6 months so that they learn critical thinking, leadership skills, entrepreneurial skills, project management, data analysis and decision making, the kind of things that employers say they are looking for, because you have hundreds of thousands of young people with college degrees in Africa looking for jobs. And we have many employers saying we can't find young people to hire who have the skills. So there's this mismatch. So we're finding those young people who have got the training but not the skills, and then we're giving them the skills and the networks to find opportunity.
I'm glad you've really broken that down, because I think sometimes in the conversation around education and skills and jobs, we kind of mix all of these things, right? The term education with skills, with employability, and those things might be separate, right? And you can have traditional education without necessarily the job skills. And so, how do you think about those things? I mean, the COVID crisis, of course, is highlighting a need for digitization in education that's unprecedented. So can we teach the skills in a digital context effectively?
You see, where people get things wrong is job creation is not about education, right? What we really need to do is to address several things at once, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But just to answer your specific question, we need to think about unlocking talent and not developing and not education, because research shows that for someone's talent to be developed, if you look at actually the data around when people attribute their growth to different aspects of their lives, they'll find that only 10% of any skill can actually be learned in a classroom. 20% of a skill is learned from what they call developmental relationships with your peers and your mentors and your coaches. And 70% comes from experience. We learn best on the job. We learn by doing. Yet today, most education is only focused on that 10%.
Sure.
Right? So we're only unlocking 10% of human potential when you are looking at, just education. The other thing about this is that universities and other academic programs, very often they are knowledge enterprises. They're not skills enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
So they are focused on creating, universities, for example, are focused much more on research.
Right.
And focused on, meeting requirements from regulators versus are we actually producing employable graduates? Are we producing entrepreneurs who can create their own jobs, right? So we're looking in the wrong place if we're looking at schools as a solution to employment. They might be an input, but they are a solution. They are just one of many things that need to come together.
Necessary, but perhaps not sufficient in that context. You have to have basic education, but many of the suggested solutions or contributors to job creation are things like what the Germans have done or what the Swiss have done with apprenticeship programs that are all about learning on the job.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at Switzerland and Germany, something like 50% of people who finish high school don't go to university. They go into these apprenticeship programs where they learn on the job. You go to work for 4 days a week and you learn 1 day a week, right? And then that's how you actually learn. and they're very low unemployment rate. So we need to be doing a lot more of that, get young people into learning by doing. But you see, I actually, there's a whole first wave of jobs that can be created which don't even need any education.
Yeah.
Right? For me, we don't have time in Africa to wait for education because we have this massive population that needs opportunity today. So there are several certain sectors which, if we unlock them with effective government policy, we can rapidly create jobs. So, for example, tourism. It's a huge job creator. But what education do you need to work in tourism? You need a warm heart. You need a smile. You need to be able to, make people feel at home. You don't need to go to school for that, right? You just need to select people with those traits. And you can, within 4 weeks, prepare someone to be a good waiter.
Yeah.
Right? You can prepare someone to be a masseuse. You can, someone who's been learning how to cook from their grandmother since they were 5 knows how to cook as a chef. So you can quickly get people into employment in something like that without needing to take them through training. Look at agriculture.
But Fred,
right?
what has been holding back? There's been so much conversation over the last 20 years that I've been working in the region about vocational learning. Oh, we need more vocational learning. We need more, masonry. We need people who know how to do electricity kind of work, that kind of, and there's not yet a seemingly scalable solutions that I've seen working on the vocational front. What do you think's holding it back in terms of that on-the-job training?
Well, again, we are looking at vocational institutions. Most of that conversation goes to vocational institutions. It's not about the institutions. It's about creating activity.
Mm-hmm.
And economic activity comes from the right government policy that attracts entrepreneurs to want to start businesses. It attracts foreign direct investment. So the most critical thing that needs to happen in Africa to create jobs is governments just must decide that they are no longer going to be hostile to job creation.
But you have a very vibrant informal sector, right? So you're living in Kenya right now, the Jua Kali, who are those that work under the sun, right? And you're out there that you see them, the furniture makers. They're very organized, even in an informal setting. And in many ways, some would say they operate like medieval guild in terms of training people on the job, but they're not official jobs, right? These are all informal endeavors, and people are making their livelihoods in the informal sector. Some countries have 50% of economic activity coming from the informal sector. So when we say jobs, are we talking about things that pay your life, your needs for income, but maybe are not structured? I mean, how do you see the informal sector fitting into this this discussion?
Yeah, we need, all kinds. What we need is economic opportunity, right? Let's not get academic about what is a job. Do you get income? People need money in there. If you get income from, being a hawker in the street, that's great. If you get income from working on a farm, that's great. If you work 3 days here and 2 days there, that's great. There's obviously informal jobs, there's formal jobs, white collar jobs, blue collar jobs. We need all of them. It's not like we just, one or the other. We need all of them. And all of that comes from economic activity, which comes first and foremost from government policy that creates the environment for economic activity to take place. So what I'm trying to say is education, vocational training, schools, that is secondary to leadership and government policy. Unless you have that right, there will be no economic activity, and you can train all you want and people will not get jobs. You can have the best vocational training schools. You can have the best universities. You produce all the supply of talent, but there is no economic activity to absorb that talent. So the first place we need to look in Africa is to get governments to make it easy for entrepreneurs to start businesses. Make it easy for investors from around the world to come and invest in your country. Get out of the way of people who are trying to create employment. And once you do that, then the engine gets going. And then young people will have opportunity. And then, yes, you now look at, okay, Within that, yes, then let's look at all the different ways in which education institutions, etc., contribute to that and prepare more young people for that. But we are looking at the wrong place if we keep going back to schools and education as the catalyst. That is not the catalyst. The catalyst is first going to be get the right environment, and then the economy will grow, and then you'll get job creation.
Is it possible to take a historical perspective when looking at this? Because when I think of my own country, the US, I don't think that we had the best government policy when jobs were created during the industrial era. I think there were huge challenges, massive corruption. Railways were laid in the US with incredible corruption. I think that if you look at the UK, when job creation was really an engine of job creation was underway in a kind of an industrial era where you had light manufacturing and the apparel industry, the garment industry, creating a lot of jobs for low educated individuals. You didn't necessarily have perfect government policy or even good government policy.
No, I'm not saying we need perfect government policy at all. I'm not saying that. Malaysia, Singapore, Singapore has always had very effective governance, but many of the Asian countries, Malaysia, Indonesia,
Vietnam, in its current creation of jobs,
high levels of corruption there. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying perfect governance. I'm saying effective enough that doesn't block basic activity from happening. Right now, many governments in Africa make it really hard for you to get a business off the ground. You're trying to get work permits for your staff, and it's difficult.
Yeah.
You're trying to get, you need basic infrastructure like electricity and internet. Government policy is making it hard for that to happen, right? You want to export your produce. The customs department. So those are the things that you need to get right first, right? As a catalyst. And until you do that, business will not happen and jobs will not be created, right? Of course, you can do the state-led approach maybe, but you then have to have a very effective state, like in China or in Ethiopia, right? So if you don't have a very effective state, then, create the environment that allows economic activity to take place.
Yeah.
And of course, figure out how then does, once those companies are being created, then companies can start partnering with education institutions to create talent for them, and you can start looking at on-the-job training, etc. But if you don't have economic activity in the first place, then who's going to do the on-the-job training for you?
No, state-led industrial growth, I don't think, is a viable mechanism for most countries in the region. I think maybe Ethiopia, Kenya's got a little bit of it, but it's much more of a mixed, diverse approach to growth than say, Ethiopia. How do you see the COVID crisis impacting education? I mean, it's accelerating trends in many different ways. And I guess one of the silver linings from my perspective is that African governments that have been very dependent on in-person interaction and moving of paper, could become more digitized in their government services and their government approaches, which would save people time and energy and increase productivity. How do you see the COVID crisis changing education on the continent?
Well, I think Africa as a whole, and in fact, the whole world, is going to become much more digital. And the only question is whether, again, this boils down to government. Can government create broadband fast enough, or and make it possible for investors to come and put broadband in your country fast enough? Because otherwise, you won't be able to capture the full potential of something like digital education, digital health, etc. So I think the way we see the situation is that there's going to be a lot more digitization, which in theory means we can educate people much faster in Africa, right? Because then students can teach themselves, they can teach each other, and get some of that 10% of what they need. But again, education is not the problem to solve. It's just an input, right? If we're trying to talk about the demographic dividend and how do we actually get young people opportunity, we need to create a whole national strategy for digitization, which means how do you create e-government? How do you think about e-health? How do you think about the whole system becoming much more digitized, not just education?
Yeah, for sure.
Because you need to get that a whole government, like what Estonia did.
Yeah.
In 2000, they said we're going to create a digital economy. So we need that. That's the first thing. The second thing I see happening is young people, to find opportunity, are going to have to be a lot more focused on entrepreneurship, because there's a global recession that COVID is bringing on board. And as a result, there are going to be fewer jobs available, both in the formal sector and in the informal sector. And so what we need to do is to catalyze young entrepreneurs to create their own jobs. And that's one of the things we're focusing on a lot more. We're trying to develop young people to become entrepreneurs and not job seekers. And then that also is another critical thing. And what we find is that young entrepreneurs tend to hire other young people more than older entrepreneurs. They don't hire young people. So if we need to get young people to become entrepreneurs. The third thing that I think is a big opportunity for Africa in this moment is to tap into remote work.
Yeah.
Because global companies are a lot more open to hiring remote workers now. And Facebook and Google are paying a software engineer $150,000 out of college. In Africa, that person would be happy with $10,000 a year. So can we produce software engineers who can then work remotely for Google but not leave Africa? Can we get an engineer in Kenya working for Siemens in Germany? A designer in Nigeria working for Zara in Spain, but you don't have to leave Africa. So I think we need to be looking at exporting our talent, but
keeping them virtual. At home. Yes.
But
yes.
Virtual exporting our talent, but then you don't have to deal with the brain drain and immigration issues, etc. And I think these are the things that what we need, unconventional thinking. Right? And we need leadership, because all of these will, we have the problems to Africans, the solutions to African problems are not that complicated. We make them overly complicated because we're not willing to do the hard things we need to do to actually execute. What we need is to stop talking and to do. And we have too much talk in Africa and not enough doing. So we need to get doing to remove the roadblocks that would actually make opportunity possible on the continent. And that comes from leadership, ultimately.
But some of the radical thinking and radical ideas do need to be there. I think there can be, a radical idea can be simple, but I do think there needs to be some, because the scale of the challenge, the job creation challenges is such that we can't have very tiny incremental, like, if countries are worried about, decreasing teacher absenteeism by 5%, that's not going to move the needle on job creation for millions right away, right? It's not going to move the needle on productivity. And that's one of the things the digitization piece is making me excited about, because some of the challenges in African cities, and we know more and more Africans are urban now, and they're not going back to rural areas. That whole making farming sexy again endeavor, it hasn't worked in any country. You need mechanization in farming. You need urban people doing incredible and productive things, creating jobs. So this question of productivity needs to be in the picture, and what is the productivity of the average worker as they bring their skills to the table. And the digitization, I think, can increase the productivity.
Yeah, absolutely, it can. Digitization can improve the productivity. It can make it possible for African talent to work remotely.
But even not commuting. Think about the commute and the traffic headaches in most African cities, from Lagos to Nairobi. If you don't have to commute, I mean, most people spend 2 to 3 hours a day commuting. The average city dweller in these cities, and that alone is a loss of productivity.
Absolutely, we lose a lot of GDP because we're just stuck in traffic in African cities. Should we take questions? Do we have any questions from people?
I've been asking, so please, if you have any questions, type them in so we can respond to them. Fred, you've talked a lot about leadership, and I know that that's core to your ethos and what you've created, starting from your TED Talk on. What countries are doing well in your view?
Oh, I will not, venture into that, naming which countries in Africa are doing well and which ones are not. I think that the countries that are doing well are the ones that are growing economically. They're creating opportunity for their people, uh, you know, and they're seeing unemployment rates drop. I mean, the single biggest issue African governments need to solve in this generation is youth unemployment, right? Because
Absolutely.
otherwise, it's a massive time bomb. So the governments that are doing well are the ones who are tackling that issue, and they're building a holistic strategy, which is enabling economic activity to take place, investment to take place, entrepreneurship to take place. They're creating an environment that is a pleasure for entrepreneurs to operate in, because if that happens, then jobs are going to be created, and then yes, they are and so one thing that I would say is that in general, African leaders have done an exceptional job of handling the COVID crisis right now. And that's something,
The health aspect of the crisis, for sure.
yes, but the economic aspect is something that is going to take longer to handle. And I think, um, you know, no one in the world has figured that out. Right now, we're dealing with a health crisis. The economic one is a longer term issue. But when the COVID crisis started, I remember many Americans calling me, almost in a sense of pity about how sorry they felt that I was in Africa and how our healthcare systems couldn't handle it, and we were really doomed. And I was looking at what was happening in the US, and I was thinking, no, you're the one who's really going to be in trouble, not us. And I think now that time has passed, it's very clear that all the doomsday predictions that were expected in Africa hasn't happened. Why? Because African leaders actually took this much more seriously. They led by example, and as a result, and the 60,000 deaths, and you look at the other day, I was looking at a picture of President Trump coming out of a meeting, and he wasn't wearing a mask, and he was surrounded by all these people who weren't wearing a mask. I see another picture that same day of President Kagame in cabinet, and he's wearing a mask very far from others. And you can that for me is really where it starts. It's again, so I think we need to recognize that in general, I often talk a lot about the things that African leaders need to do better, but I think it's also important to recognize when they have done a good job.
Right.
And I think that African leaders in this moment have actually they've taken this crisis a lot more seriously, and as a result, I think Africa has weathered the health part of this much better than everyone expected, and now we need to turn our attention to the economy.
Yep.
And the same level of focus and prioritization that was brought to the crisis, we need to apply the same to kickstarting our economies. And then once you kickstart the economies, then the jobs that we're talking about will come.
Yeah, and one of the areas that I think is very promising, and we just had a question about it as well, is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We know when the rest of the world, so you were talking about where Africa is shining compared to the rest of the world, and particularly to my country, the US, on the healthcare side in terms of fighting COVID, also on free trade. While a lot of countries in the world are stepping back from free trade, African countries are leaning in and have created the largest free trade area since the creation of the WTO. And Wamkele is very young, he's dynamic, and he is the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And one of the areas of innovation they've had is to say, okay, we can even do digital trade negotiations and focus on digital trade in the short term. And so how do you think the Continental Free Trade area will impact youth employment and the job creation challenge?
Like I've said, anything that increases economic activity will solve youth unemployment. So clearly, having a bigger market, less fragmented, makes Africa a lot more attractive for people to invest in. It's gonna mean we can start to build economies of scale on the continent, and should drive economic growth and I mean, right now we're doing only about 15% of our trade within the continent compared to 80% in Europe. So if we can get the free trade agreement actually executed, because again, we've got lots of ideas in Africa, but the execution is always the difficult part. So the policy is great. Now let's get it executed, and then that should make it should encourage more economic growth in Africa, and then ultimately that should lead to more opportunities for young people. So I think it's a step in the right direction. We definitely need to trade more with each other as African countries, and we also need to figure out how does Africa become more competitive in trading with the rest of the world, because that's also where we need to capture a lot more value.
And one of the areas, because I agree completely on the execution challenge, because of what's on the books versus what's on the streets is often a very, very big difference. But one of the areas that's been inspiring in terms of execution is free movement of labor. And if you think of free trade, including free movement of goods, free movement of people, and free movement of capital. One of the areas where we've seen a lot of progress is the free movement of people in terms of visa-free travel across Africa. And if you even think of ECOWAS has been there for 40 plus years, and it's supposed to have free movement of goods and people and capital. And often the goods are stopped because of a variety of non-tariff barriers, borders, checkpoints, but an ECOWAS passport does allow ECOWAS citizens to travel easily between ECOWAS countries. And you're seeing more and more countries drop visa requirements for other Africans. And so for me, that's very inspiring in terms of talent mobility on the continent. What are you seeing in that area?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent trend. Many countries in Africa have started removing visa restrictions. I think Mauritius and Rwanda were some of the first to do it, but many other countries have now started doing it. Ghana, Senegal, I believe also Ethiopia. So then African entrepreneurs can start traveling easier and doing business, and then that is one of the factors that are going to be critical to actually see some of the fruits of something like the continental free trade area. If we have the policy but people can't move around, then I want to export something to another country, I need to go and meet my counterpart. I need to do business, and so I think the policy needs to be supported with free movement of people, freer movement of people, easier ability to get work permits, across the continent, and easier. We also need to make foreign exchange controls, easier so that you can actually transact across the continent. I think we also need to develop a Pan-African digital infrastructure that will allow, a lot of activity to happen on the continental scale as well. And then we need to also liberalize and harmonize regulations so that if you are trying to build something across countries, you don't have to go and register with every single regulatory body as you're trying to scale what you're doing.
And you've grown up in a way that, as an example of kind of Pan-African experience, born in Ghana, growing up in Botswana in part, and many of the students that you bring to ALA and ALU end up being Pan-African in nature. And so how do you think about this next generation of leaders? Are they coming out with a Pan-African perspective, able to move and work across the region in the same way that maybe many others, Nkrumah and others, had a vision of Pan-Africanism back at independence? Do we have a new Pan-Africanism today?
Well, certainly the leaders that we're developing are growing up in a Pan-African way. So we are working with leaders from 45, 50 countries across the continent at any given time. And they're building relationships with each other. They are developing a continental view. They're understanding the continent's great challenges and great opportunities. And and they are going to have relationships with each other so that that social capital that we need to create more trust amongst each other as Africans, those are the foundations that also will support things like, doing business together and doing trade together, and many of the things that will drive the economic activity and the growth and then ultimately the job creation. So absolutely. But I think that the one difference that, at least we are trying to instill in the leaders that we're developing is they're fighting for a different fight than Nkrumah and Nyerere were fighting for, which they were fighting for independence, political independence. What this new generation of leaders needs to fight for is economic independence. And it's about creating wealth and prosperity and jobs. And that's the battle that they need to fight. It's a different fight from what the previous generation had.
And the fact that they're learning within the continent is pretty amazing. I just did a basic survey looking at the number of African presidents today, current African leaders today, the number that have had studied in the US. Because I was arguing that the US education, tertiary education, is a very strong export, and it suits the US long-term competitiveness to continue to have educational relationships with Africans and African elite. And 11 presidents today studied in the US. And that could be changing based on what you're producing, whereas Africans could be staying on the continent for a stellar global education.
Yep. We definitely expect we're going to train a few African presidents.
And so how do you see, though, partnerships supporting this effort? We know that Carnegie Mellon has a campus in Rwanda, that there are partnerships between American universities and African institutions. How do you see US and European institutions supporting your vision and what you're doing?
I think you see there's a huge opportunity for collaboration between global universities and global schools in general with Africa as we try to unlock Africa's potential as human capital. Because you see, one of the things that education used to be about acquisition of information
and network,
and you would have to get that from because information was a scarce thing. So you had to go to the physical university to get the information from the library book or from the head of the professor. Information is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And so if we can tap into online content from MIT, Yale, Harvard, Oxford, University of Singapore, whatever it is, which knowledge has been created over centuries, which is now much more easily accessible thanks to technology, then it allows African youth to be able to teach themselves without needing even a professor, because then they can learn by themselves with this access to this content. They can teach each other with peer-to-peer learning, and then they can apply it in real world, and then they can get going. And we don't have to wait until we have all the professors in the world to teach them. So that's one thing where I think universities around the world, if they make their content available, they put it all online, like we've seen with MIT and Coursera and Udacity and all these edX, that is a huge opportunity for Africans to be able to educate themselves.
Yep.
Because as human beings, we have a natural ability to learn. Just think about it. We start learning and teaching ourselves at the age of 6 months. There's no curriculum that teaches you how to walk. You learn by yourself. There's no curriculum that teaches you language. You learn by yourself. So when we go to school, we then start to take away that natural ability for you, and we make you more and more helpless. And the teacher starts doing your learning, and then by the time you get to college, you're completely helpless. So you go back to that 6-month-old self, and then get young people in Africa to realize that they actually can drive their own learning, especially if you can give them technology, and then you have access to all this content from the world, which universities and schools are putting online. Then we can unlock a revolution in education in Africa. But that is not enough for creating the jobs.
Right.
That is only one of the ingredients. We need to then support it with government policy. We need to create entrepreneurs. We need to build different ways of driving our economy. And then with that, we will be able to absorb all this youth potential that we're creating.
How do you respond to those who say, well, there are so many entrepreneurs who are out there in say, Nairobi or Kinshasa, et cetera, but if you actually offered them a stable job, they would take it. It's just that they're an entrepreneur by default. And that they're, as an entrepreneur, they're not necessarily creating that many jobs, maybe 1 or 2 other jobs that are just people working for them, but they're not creating a business that can scale. And so that this idea of entrepreneuring your way out is not necessarily really viable. How do you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, I think that really just is probably a naive understanding of entrepreneurship, right? I think that there are different kinds of entrepreneurs. You have what I call subsistence entrepreneurs,
Yes.
who are simply doing it to survive, and they are not creating employment, they're just employing themselves. I will take that any day, because at least that is one less unemployed person, even if they're employing themselves only or they're employing one other person. You then need the other type of entrepreneur, which is, the opportunity entrepreneur or the growth entrepreneur, who is not being an entrepreneur simply as a way of survival because they don't have anything else to do, but they're really seeing an opportunity. And I believe that most entrepreneurs are driven to solve problems for society. And in Africa, we have a lot of problems to solve. We have healthcare problems, climate change, infrastructure, the empowerment of women. We have so many problems. All of those problems, urbanization is another big problem, means phenomenal entrepreneurial opportunities, right? So those are the kinds of entrepreneurs that then end up creating jobs. Because if you look at the fact that there's hundreds of millions of people going to move into African cities in the next 40 years, I think something like 700 million people. That's going to create a lot of problems in urban areas around low-cost housing, sanitation, transportation, traffic. So all those problems are business opportunities, right? Because someone will make, who's going to become the garbage billionaire? Who's going to figure out how to collect all the garbage in the cities as more and more people come in? You're going to end up creating jobs. Someone has to figure out how to create housing for all those hundreds of millions of people. Low-cost housing. That's going to employ thousands of people. And again, that kind of job doesn't necessarily need 5 years of education. I can train you quickly to learn how to lay bricks, to build those houses, right? So that's the kind of activity that will create employment. And that's what I mean by governments will make it easy for those kinds of growth and opportunity entrepreneurs to get their businesses started and to sustain them.
And so in that way, do you see African countries following a different or forging a different path than, say, the other developed countries of the world that created jobs through light manufacturing and industrial growth? Will, African countries today are less industrial than they were in 1980, right? So are we going to see kind of I don't love the term leapfrogging, but a skipping of or a forging of a new path for mass job creation?
Yeah, I think that we clearly can't. We need to look at the situation that we're in today, and we need to apply all methods. So there will be some growth in manufacturing in Africa. I think COVID is showing that we need to build our own
factories,
supply chains. We spend a lot of wealth and our limited resources importing things into Africa. We spend $40 billion importing food into Africa that we have perfect conditions to grow. That's a travesty. That can all be job creation, right? We're importing furniture, we're importing cars, we're importing everything. So we should look at which areas we can actually be. So even if it's not export-led growth, import substitution, right? Let's identify the places where Africa can be competitive and build local champions and save that money that we're sending outside. We can spend it inside, and then that can create jobs and it can build.
And that's where the free trade agreement will really matter, because one of the things that stopped any kind of effective import substitution strategies on the continent for the last 40 years has been small markets, small fragmented, high cost of transport markets. So hopefully those costs come down with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and you're able to do that. I also think there's kind of a deviation in that, for example, when large jobs were created, numbers of jobs were created, say in UK, what they could do is those that didn't get jobs, the second-born sons, the young, angry, aspirational men that were in their cities, where did they send them? They sent them to the empire, to India, to the US. Get out of here. Don't sit in our city, because that's problematic. When the US went through rapid industrialization and job growth, but many were left out, where did we send our young men? We sent them west. Go west, young man. Grow up with this country. Go find your opportunity elsewhere, outside of New York, outside of Boston, because, you sitting in the city, is an element of potential foment, right? And so I think of a Nigerian, I think, where can they send their young men, young women? This idea of a frontier of opportunity has to be created in the digital realm. Otherwise, you don't have the content, you don't have the space unless we, I don't know, do something like mine the moon or explore the oceans where we have an open frontier of opportunity. Without that physical frontier, I think we need a digital frontier. So, I mean, we're running out of time here, Fred, but try to paint us a picture for the future. I mean, what gives you hope? And really, what's your most pie in the sky radical idea for the future of job creation in African markets?
Well, I mean, my hope and what the most radical idea that would catalyze job creation in Africa is just simply for what I've been saying all along is, can we get governments to actually stop being hostile to job creation? And that's a decision that governments need to make. Is we're going to create policies that make it easy for businesses to operate in our country, for foreign investment to come into our country, and for local entrepreneurs to get off the ground. Let's execute the African Continental Free Trade Area. And for that, we don't need to worry about export markets. We don't need to worry about, whether those are all simple decisions that we need to make as governments and that is going to catalyze the first wave of job creation. Then the second wave of job creation is going to come from, developing, one idea, one wish I would have, like we need a, multi-billion-dollar venture capital fund to invest in young African entrepreneurs, right? To create, young people who are going to create the jobs for themselves and for others, right? And that's another thing that we need to get off the ground. And then we also need to become much more, we need to capture this moment. So one of the things I really believe is that constraints drives innovation. And so we have a lot of constraints in Africa, and we've now got one more constraint, which is COVID. So that means we need unconventional ideas. We don't need best practice in Africa, we need new practice. We need to reimagine and leapfrog and create new ways of doing things. And yes, we can't just copy how Asia grew and how Latin America. We need to say, okay, given where we are now, how do we position Africa to really capture all of these challenges and opportunities through innovation? Because that is really how we are going to get out of this. We need innovation. We can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And if we do that, we will solve this problem.
And I think on your idea of the billion-dollar venture fund, one of the exciting things is the venture space is rapidly growing. We've seen almost 50% increase year on year in venture, and last year over $1 billion was raised for African venture funds, though that's very, very, very small compared to the opportunity at hand. But one way is the same way you're thinking about creating a whole cadre of leaders. We need a cadre of angel investors who are also individuals investing in the next generation of businesses, because that way you get quickly to $1 billion or more when you have individuals doing that all across different markets, not just individuals, companies, corporate ventures, almost non-existent outside of South Africa. So I think there are many small steps that equal that big, giant resource for entrepreneurs. That's an area I'm passionate about, and I know we can do more through African Leadership Network in terms of angel investing and angel investing circles. So something we can work on together as we go forward. But I want to thank you today, Fred, for taking the time to join us from Nairobi and have this conversation. Job creation is the biggest challenge facing the continent, and it's facing the world. And I don't understand how every African president doesn't wake up with nightmares every night about the potential of a lack of jobs in the region and what it means for Europe in terms of migration, the US in terms of migration and immigration. These are challenges we all need our best minds and energies brought to. So thanks again, Fred, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Pleasure.
Thanks.